Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to look into a very interesting but dark chapter in human history, witch hunts. When we think of the term, it invokes images of fear, mass hysteria, and persecution. The common portrayal of witches comes as a product of religious beliefs and irrational fears. To quote Lewis Caroll, "Sentence first, verdict afterwards," is the motto that these hunts followed. Fear is what drove them, and individual rights were non-existent. If you were accused, you were automatically guilty. This led to horrific consequences for a lot of people and left a lasting impact on societies all over the world. Settle in as we explore the 7 most sinister witch hunts in history. Before we get into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed.
The Salem Witch Trials, 1692 to 1693, USA. The Salem Witch Trials is one of the most infamous witch hunts we've ever seen, and it took place in Salem, Massachusetts between the years 1962 and 63. This was an event that invoked images of an unbridled use of power and discrimination. More than 200 people were accused and persecuted, with many being slaughtered. 19 people were executed, 1 man died of torture, and 5 more died because of bad jail conditions, all of which were consequences of a society that was plagued by irrational fear and mass hysteria. Religious fanaticism and economic tensions between Salem village and town played a role in this bloodshed. The village had a social divide which contributed to the mayhem. There was also a rivalry between the 2 leading families in the village, the Porters and the Putnams. Samuel Parris became the pastor of the church through Putnam's influence. There was a conflict of ideas between communities, between the Puritan idea of public goodwill and the capitalist idea of private interest. Parris's preaching divided his congregation. The richer families opposed him, while the poorer ones were on his side. It's believed that family rivalries also played a part in these trials. Some scholars also believe that the trials were a result of violence and scapegoating because the economy was deteriorating from extreme winters. In January 1692, Parris's daughter and niece started experiencing hysterical fits and behaving bizarrely after experimenting with fortune-telling games, which were considered to be wicked by the Puritans. After a month of this behavior, a doctor believed they were under an evil hand. When the girls were pressured to tell who was bewitching them, they blamed Tituba, their slave, and 2 other women, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good, who were imprisoned and put on trial. The one thing that these 3 women had in common is that they were all outcasts. Tituba was a Native American woman. There were racial dynamics at play here which helped the spread of these trials. Osborne was considered to be promiscuous and Good was poor. The status of these women held in society contributed to their conviction. As you can see, it was a ruthless persecution of minorities. Tituba's trial was the most important. Not only did she confess to being a witch, but she also claimed that there was a whole coven in Salem. Her confession was found to be credible because of her culture, which was associated with demons and witchcraft by white Europeans. Her statement ensured that these trials would not be the last of them. Tituba also claimed that an elderly white man was the one who was leading these satanic activities in Salem. What this did was create doubts that evil could come from their own instead of just outsiders. Soon, other girls started showing symptoms. One among them was Anne Putnam, one of the leaders among the accusers. When a respectable woman, Martha Corey, was accused, a tone was set. Nobody was safe anymore. More girls started being afflicted, and the court of Oyer and Terminer was established to handle this. From March to September, trials were held. It was systemic violence against women because of the patriarchal belief that they were more easily susceptible to evil and because some dared to be independent or different from the norm. Though women were an overwhelming majority, men too were convicted. A controversial aspect of the trial was how they used spectral evidence. Puritans were under the belief that witches could project their spirits and harm people without actually moving. Legitimizing such evidence meant that people didn't necessarily have to see them harm someone, they could just randomly accuse others. There was a backlash against these trials by October. Accusations were made against prominent ladies, including the governor's wife, and the court was finally dissolved. In 1706, Anne Putnam made a public confession stating that the whole thing was a delusion that was caused by Satan. It took more than 250 years for the state of Massachusetts to finally apologize for this. The abuse of power that took place during these trials contributed to changes in court procedures in the US. It played a role in guaranteeing the rights for legal representation, cross-examining accusers, and presuming innocence instead of guilt. The Wburg and Bamberg Witch Trials, 1626 to 1631, Germany. Between 1580 and 1650, the witch craze was at its peak in Europe. Most of these witchcraft trials were local issues with only a few victims, but in some places it became massive, and they were great witch hunts like those in Wburg and Bamberg. These were small territories in Germany that were a part of the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by prince bishops who spearheaded the witch hunts. These were both Catholic territories with a Protestant minority, and this played a significant role when the accusations of witchcraft began to increase. But the 30 Years' War, which started as one over religious freedom that later turned into political struggle, was a major source of tension. There was economic stagnation, one that was long-term. There was bad weather, failing crops, and also an outbreak of the plague. It was a society that lived in a state of fear. There is no specific cause that people have attributed to the start of the witch trials in Wburg and Bamberg, but one theory is that it was because of a failed harvest. In May 1626, after a severe frost damaged a majority of the crops in Bamberg, there were petitions raised questioning why witches and sorcerers were destroying the crops. There are also judicial documents that we can find where a woman who was accused confessed to attempts of destroying the crops. Similarly, trials in Wburg also have similar cases where people were executed for freezing wine crops. From 1626 to 1632, 900 people were executed in Bamberg alone. In Wburg, it was confirmed that 157 people were executed. It's estimated that over 900,000 people were executed, but only a few were recorded. These were people from all walks of life, even children, and they were either beheaded and burnt at the stake or burnt alive. But witch hunting didn't exactly start in these years in these two territories. Between 1616 and 1617, there were around 300 executions in Wburg and 18 in Bamberg. It would have continued if the war didn't begin in 1618, but in 1626, it started all over again. In both these places, the rules had absolute power and they abused it. Accusations that came from torture were the main cause of the mass hysteria that took place. The purpose of torture here wasn't to punish them, it was to look for acquaintances. The people who were accused were also forced to accept that they were involved in using harmful magic, participated in Sabbaths, and had intercourse with Satan. Eventually, the witch hunts slowed down in both places. Many events seem to have contributed to this. The elites were afraid that they would be accused, and there was also the fact that the people who were certainly innocent were being executed in large numbers. The Jesuits were also a reason for this. One of the priests came to the realization, finally, that it was torture that was leading these innocent people to their deaths and not the truth. He wrote a book anonymously, which was later taken to a Protestant town and printed and circulated very widely. There was also the invasion of Germany by the Swedish king, so by 1632, the witch hunts finally came to an end. The Pendle Witch Trials, 1612, England. England's most famous witch trials are those of the Pendle witches in 1612, where 12 people were accused of witchcraft. The name given to those arrested in or near the Pendle forest is the Lancashire witches. These people were tried under the English law of 1604 for practicing witchcraft. These trials were recorded by Thomas Potts and later published as a book. Out of the 12 witches, 6 came from rival families of Demdike and Chaddocks. The Demdike blamed the Chaddockses for breaking into their home and stealing. All this started with Alison Device, who was begging for pins from peddler John Law. When he refused, she cursed him, and he was paralyzed. His son Abraham, hearing this news, went to visit his father, and when he took Alison to meet John, she asked him to forgive her. Abraham then started these trials by making accusations against her. She quickly confessed to the magistrate and also admitted that she was initiated into witchcraft by her grandmother, Old Demdike. She brought up instances where she believed her grandmother was responsible for the death of a cow and that of a girl. She also brought up the rivalry between Old Demdike and Old Chaddocks, believing the latter caused her father's death. Both of these families were poor and they were both led by widows. It's even said that Old Demdike was known as a witch for more than 50 years. The deaths in other villages that happened way before the trials began were also brought up and Chaddocks was accused. Alison's brother, James, also brought up that she cursed a child. When they were questioned, both Old Demdike and Old Chaddocks confessed that they sold their souls. After hearing all the accusations, the judge detained 4 people and they awaited a trial. However, things didn't end there. When James held a meeting, the people who were sympathizers of the family came to attend. They were summoned for questioning and later on for a trial. What's interesting here is that a 9-year-old, Janet Device, was allowed to be the key person who gave evidence. She gave a testimony against those who attended the meeting, mentioning her own mother, brother, and sister. The Pendle witches were tried alongside the Salemsbury witches, who were accused of cannibalism and child murder, along with Margaret Pearson, who was accused of killing a horse, and Isabel Robley, who was accused of causing sickness. Except for Alice Nutter, the Pendle witches were all poor. Like Alison Device, some of these people genuinely believed they were guilty and confessed. Others protested to the very end. King James, who was interested in Protestant theology and witchcraft, wrote a book, Daemonology, where he encouraged his readers to condemn it. Many believe that a monarch who displayed such paranoia openly in a book made the Lancashire witch trials inevitable. Initially, English law required people to make accusations and juries from the community to give verdict, but by 1604, it made conjuring spirits a capital offense. Through Potts's book, these trials gave legal proof that James was right. The Basque Witch Trials, 1609 to 1614, Spain. The Basque trials lasted from 1609 to 1614, and during this time, more than 7,000 witches were accused and examined. But of those, only 11 people were executed, 5 were burned in effigy, and 6 were burned alive. It was one of the largest witch trials in Europe, which involved the Spanish Inquisition, and accusations were made against many people. Surprisingly, women were not the only targets here. It was more about the eradication of heresy than it was about misogyny. Children were the largest group of people to be accused in these trials, and they, in turn, accused many other people because they were scared of the interrogation. The trials spread from France to northern Spain. The Pyrenees Mountains split Basque country between Spain and France. Despite the difficulties, people traveled over these mountains for trading. This spread the idea of witchcraft to Spain, where trials sparked because of the ones in France. The Basques found themselves in an oppressive situation because of the Catholic Church's domination, which sought to suppress alternative religious beliefs. The trials didn't start with the Inquisition, they came in later on. It started with Maria de Zimildegu, who returned to Zugarramurdi from Sibore, where witchcraft trials were being held. She told her family how she had renounced her faith and she was inducted into a coven. She then accused her aunt and other girls of witchcraft, many of whom confessed. People were threatened with torture so they would confess. The fear spread to other towns too, and soon the Inquisition came in. The Inquisition had sole jurisdiction over investigating cases of superstition and witchcraft. People even preferred this to local authorities because they were less cruel. Their involvement made sure that no one person could gain too much power and control over those accused. Skeptics, like the Bishop of Pamplona and Inquisitor Salazar, also pointed out the flaws in the evidence and confessions in these trials. Salazar also believed confessions to be false and a result of fear. He saw no solid evidence of witchcraft when he traveled through the countryside in 1611. The Inquisitor General in 1614 ruled that all cases must be dismissed after a majority of those who confessed retracted. These are some very uncommon elements compared to the other trials that we've seen. You might even say that this is a more humane witch trial than the others that have taken place. The Torsshocker Witch Trials, 1675, Sweden. The largest witch trial in Swedish history, the Torsshocker trials took place in 1675. In just one day, 71 people were beheaded and then burnt at the stake, while the Torsshocker parish was taken over by a panic regarding witchcraft. During medieval times in Sweden, when the country was Catholic, due to the law on slander and insults, accusing a woman of being a witch was a huge insult and could lead to larger fines for the accuser. Witchcraft that resulted in the deaths of humans and animals and the destruction of property could lead to trials and the death penalty, but that too required strong evidence and 6 witnesses. Allegations about magic were handled by the church with lesser punishments. Good spells were in common use, but during the 16th century, when the country became Protestant, those good spells started being considered prayers to the devil. In 1668, a 12-year-old girl was accused of walking on water by a young boy. A trial was conducted, and she was sentenced to death by the parish priest. Her sentence was then changed by the courts to flogging instead. She went on to accuse many other women from her village of attending the Sabbath. Mass hysteria was the result of these accusations. The government assigned a group of priests and lawyers to help the courts with the trials. Children's testimonies were considered the evidence for many death sentences. Torture, which was previously deemed to be forbidden, was now suddenly okay because the courts could not execute people without proper evidence. All this escalated in Torsshocker, where children were executed without confirmation from the High Court. The priest Horneus had young children identify the witches. It is through his grandson, who wrote the story as told by his grandmother, that we know of these stories. Because even though it was a huge trial, there was very little information regarding it. The priest manipulated the children into giving evidence. He would scare them with torture, put them in ice-cold water, in ovens, threatening he would boil them. Some witnesses suffered the consequences of his torture for years after. On one occasion, even his own wife was accused, but the boy took back his statement after she slapped him, which was when he recognized who she was. People were taken up a mountain and beheaded away from the stake so it wouldn't get too bloody. Their families then carried them to the stake and they were burned. The trials didn't end there. They continued in other places in Sweden until 1676. Authorities proved that these child witnesses were lying, and in 1677, priests were ordered to tell people that all the witches in Sweden had been expelled. The North Berwick Trials, 1590 to 1592, Scotland. The trial proceedings in Scotland from 1590 to 1592 that inspired King James VI of Scotland to write his treatise, Daemonology, are the North Berwick witch trials, in which he was directly involved. A few decades before these trials, witchcraft had two types of magic, white and black, but as Scotland went through the process of Reformation, all kinds of magic were looked at as evil by both the church and the state. The trials weren't just for witchcraft, it was for treason too. It was believed that the witches attended meetings with the devil where they plotted the death of the king. The Scottish Witchcraft Act was published in 1563, which gave the basis on how the accused were tried, and anyone involved with it was to get the death penalty. The accusations of witchcraft first began with James's attempts to bring his wife to Scotland from Denmark. She was unable to get to Scotland because they experienced a terrible storm on the way. One of the Scottish ships even got lost. The blame for all of this was placed on witches. He was directly involved in these trials after spending time in Denmark in contact with trials there. Around 70 people, most of whom were women, were tortured and put on trial. Treason against the king was a main factor in these trials, and they sought to get more information on who else was involved. Gellis Duncan was the first to be accused. She pointed fingers towards other suspects. Another primary suspect was Agnes Sampson, who was known for her healing skills. She was brutally tortured. Her hair was shaved, she was chained to a wall, and forced to wear a witch's bridle, which kept her from talking and left her with no sleep. After all of this, she confessed and was strangled and burned. Shakespeare used many concepts from these trials in his famous work Macbeth. King James's treatise also went on to have a considerable impact on England and the trials that took place there. The Trier Witch Trials, 1581 to 1593, Germany. The last set of trials that we're going to take a look at in today's video is the Trier Witch Trials. These persecutions began in the Diocese of Trier in 1581. It reached the city around 1587, and the largest mass execution took place when around 368 people were led to their deaths. Johann von Schonenberg was appointed as the Archbishop in 1581, and he wanted to make sure that his territory was filled with good Catholics because of the religious wars that were taking place in Europe. He started by getting rid of Protestants first, and then the Jews and the witches. He put Peter Binsfeld in charge of this, who was strictly against witchcraft. Binsfeld believed witches made pacts with devils, could fly, and had intercourse with demons. He was also under the impression that torture was necessary to get confessions, and it was used mercilessly. Almost a third of those who were burnt were people from the nobility and those in local government. This spread to other territories too. They wanted to start their own witch hunts. In 1588, 2 villages were left with only 1 woman in each place. The population began to go down because of mass executions. Dietrich Flade, the chief judge of the electoral court, presided over some trials. He didn't approve of using torture and was more lenient. As a result, witch hunters began to suspect him, and soon, many of the accused started pointing fingers at him. He too was executed. Cornelius Loos, a Catholic priest, was another person who was questioned in these trials. He wanted to publish a manuscript on his thoughts, but he was arrested and forced to take back his words. He was constantly under surveillance and was imprisoned many times. Soon, he died from the plague, but by the time Loos recanted his words, the witch hunts started to slow down. The trials didn't stop, they continued to go on, but the main days were over. It was certainly a dark period because those who dared to question the hunters were also mercilessly persecuted. Soon, news about this gained a lot of attention in Europe because of how huge the trials were. Pamphlets about them were published in Denmark. It influenced other trials, like the Copenhagen trials, which was the first major witch trial in Denmark. It was also very closely connected to the North Berwick trials in Scotland. Marvelous verdict! With that, we come to the end of our video. Witch hunts were a result of widespread paranoia and mass hysteria with catastrophic consequences on entire communities. We look at it as history, but it had a devastating impact. People were mercilessly massacred, and it shouldn't be forgotten. History has provided us with so many lessons, but we still don't avoid persecution. Tyranny and genocide continue to go on. Minorities are still being violently persecuted all across the world. Have we really evolved as a community, or do we still propagate these horrors today, but just in different ways? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for more marvelous content, and as always, thanks for watching.